Welcome to our deep dive into the Indigenous World 2007 report. It's like a snapshot of what was happening for Indigenous peoples worldwide back then.
A snapshot across continents. We'll be looking at their challenges and, of course, their victories.
Yeah, I'm really excited to learn from this deep dive.
You and me both. We're going to be covering a ton. Land rights, cultural preservation, political representation, and the impact of globalization.
It's fascinating how those themes connect across so many different cultures, you know? It really shows their resilience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And their ability to adapt in a world that's constantly changing.
Now, the editor's note in the report sounds pretty hopeful. They talk about Indigenous voices finally being heard and making a real difference.
Right. They were starting to see some real change.
Like what kind of change? Can you give me some specifics?
Well, more policies were being created to protect Indigenous rights. They were winning court cases, and even businesses were becoming more aware of things like land rights.
That's great to hear.
Oh, yeah, there were some big wins that year. Like in Botswana, the High Court said relocating the San people from the Central Kalahari Game Reserve was unlawful.
That must have been huge for them.
It was. And in Argentina, the Lakahanhat community finally got their land rights case heard by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And get this, some indigenous communities in Russia and Arctic Canada were actually negotiating agreements with oil companies.
Wow, negotiating with big oil, that's impressive. But I'm guessing 2007 wasn't all good news, right?
Of course not. There were definitely some tough challenges, too. Let's head up north to Greenland.
Okay.
They were in some pretty intense negotiations with Denmark about self-governance.
Yeah, that struggle for autonomy must have been tough.
It was. Some Greenlanders wanted full independence, while certain Danish politicians wanted a share of any future oil and gas profits. It's like this classic conflict over resources.
How did they even find common ground?
Well, Joseph Motzfeldt, who was Greenland's Minister of Finance and Foreign Affairs at the time, said something interesting. He said something like, "The future of a country depends on setting the past aside without forgetting it, and looking forward without being naive." So, acknowledging the past, but working towards a better future.
Makes sense. Now, what about Sápmi? They were dealing with land rights issues too, weren't they?
Yep, the Finnmark Act in Norway was a big one. It was all about who owned the land traditionally used by the Sámi in Finnmark.
So what happened?
They created something called the Finnmark Estate to manage the land. And the Sámi Parliament, the Saamidigi, was given a role in making guidelines about how Sámi interests would be considered in decisions about the land.
So at least they had a voice.
Yeah, but there was still criticism. Some thought the guidelines were too bureaucratic, and the Saamidigi argued that it didn't fully implement ILO Convention 169, which is all about Indigenous people's rights to their land and resources.
Right, so a step forward, but still a long way to go.
Exactly. Now let's move on to Russia. The big issue there in 2007 was the lack of clear land rights for Indigenous peoples, even though RIPON, the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, kept pushing for it.
So even with an organization fighting for their rights, their land ownership still wasn't legally recognized.
Pretty much. See, there was this conflict between the federal law on territories of traditional nature use and the land code. The law said they could use the land, but the land code didn't back it up.
Sounds like a recipe for exploitation.
Yeah, and it was. Extraction companies could just come in and get land allotments without needing consent from the indigenous communities because legally they didn't own the land.
Wow, talk about a David and Goliath situation. Was there anything hopeful happening in Russia at the time?
Well, they did create the Public Chamber, which is like a government advisory body, and there were some big indigenous figures on board, like Pavel Selyanzyga. So it was a chance for dialogue, at least.
Let's hope that led to something good. Okay, let's jump to North America now, Alaska and Canada.
Okay, so in Alaska, there was the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, ANCSA, from 1971. And this is interesting because it used business corporations to settle land claims.
So instead of giving land back directly to the communities, they created corporations to manage it.
Yep, and those corporations have had mixed results. Some did great, some struggled, and some even went bankrupt.
Makes sense. A business isn't guaranteed to succeed, even if it's for a good cause.
Right, but in 2006, all 12 of the regional corporations actually made a profit.
That's encouraging. What do you think helped them turn things around?
Government contracting played a big role. They secured billions of dollars in contracts, which allowed them to take on projects all over the world, from training security guards in Iraq to renovating U.S. consulates in Brazil.
Wow. From Iraq to Brazil, that is impressive. But I bet some people weren't happy with ANCSA, right?
Yeah, a lot of indigenous people felt that it focused too much on business and not enough on their traditional ways of managing the land.
I can see their point. And then, of course, there's the debate over opening ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, to oil development.
That was a hot topic, and it really divided the Alaska Native community. Some, like the Inupiat Corporation, saw it as an economic opportunity, while others, like the Gwich'in Athabascan people, were fiercely against it.
They were worried about the environmental impact.
Exactly. They were really concerned about protecting the Arctic ecosystem.
I can see both sides of that argument. Now, what was happening in Canada?
One of the big issues in Canada was the lack of legal protection for Aboriginal women's property rights on reserves, particularly when it came to divorce or separation.
That doesn't seem right.
Yeah, it was a huge injustice. And even though the Minister of Indian Affairs promised to address it, nothing really changed.
So empty promises, unfortunately. Anything else going on in Canada?
Well, there was the land dispute and reoccupation by the Six Nations people in Caledonia, Ontario. They were protesting a housing development on land they claimed as theirs, based on an old treaty.
Ugh. Land claims and historical treaties always a complicated issue. Were there any bright spots in Canada that year?
A few. The 2005 residential school's final agreement was finally confirmed, which aimed to compensate survivors of that horrible system. And the Supreme Court of Canada upheld First Nations' right to access natural resources in their traditional territories.
So some glimmers of hope there. All right, let's move south to the United States. What were some of the big indigenous issues playing out there?
One big issue was the struggle within the Cherokee Nation over freedmen citizenship. These were descendants of formerly enslaved people who were granted citizenship in the Cherokee Nation after the Civil War.
So this was about who gets to be considered Cherokee.
Right, and it got really complex. The Cherokee Nation Council wanted to limit citizenship to those with Indian blood, which would exclude the freedmen.
Wow, it's like trying to erase a part of their history.
A lot of people saw it that way. And the U.S. government even got involved. The Department of the Interior wouldn't recognize the new Constitution because the freedmen weren't allowed to vote on it. It went to court.
Wow, so it went beyond internal tribal matters.
It did. A federal judge ruled that the freedmen had the right to sue the Cherokee leadership.
What was his reasoning for that?
He said the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also applied to the Cherokee Nation. Basically, they couldn't discriminate based on race, even if other parts of the Constitution didn't apply to tribal governments.
That makes sense.
Yeah, but the Cherokee chief argued they didn't need federal approval for their constitution, and that the freedmen didn't belong in an Indian nation. It highlights the tension between tribal sovereignty and federal law, especially when it comes to defining who's Indian.
It's such a complicated issue. Anything else happening in the U.S. related to indigenous identity?
Well, there was a lot of debate about NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act.
Remind me what that act was about.
It's about returning Native American remains and cultural objects to their tribes. But there was this controversy about defining Native American for the act.
Right, because who gets to claim those ancestral remains and artifacts?
Exactly. The definition in IWGIA limited it to existing tribes that could prove a cultural connection.
So what about people who couldn't prove that direct link, like pre-Columbian peoples?
That was the issue. Critics said it excluded pre-Columbian peoples from being considered Native American, which was a problem for NAGPRA. It meant that many archaeological finds on public lands couldn't automatically be repatriated.
So a law meant to right historical wrongs was actually creating new ones. Okay, let's head south now. What was happening in Central and South America in 2007?
Well, in Mexico, the Zapatistas, the revolutionary indigenous group, were doing something called the Other Campaign.
Other campaign? That sounds interesting.
It was. The Zapatistas, known for their armed struggle, were trying something new. They were reaching out to other marginalized groups to create a broader social movement.
So a more inclusive approach.
Exactly. And it wasn't all big political stuff. There was local action, too. Like a Mazahua community took over a water treatment plant demanding basic services.
Wow, taking direct action.
They also called for recognizing indigenous people as guardians of water resources.
Makes sense. Speaking of, Hurricane Stan had devastated parts of Guatemala back in 2005. What was the situation like there 2 years later?
The government was leading reconstruction, but there were complaints about delays and how everything was being politicized.
So aid wasn't getting to the people who needed it most.
Yeah, that was a concern. Indigenous organizations actually stepped up and proposed a national agreement on risk management to try and prevent future disasters.
Shifting from reaction to prevention, good idea.
Definitely. Okay, what about Ecuador? They had that big indigenous uprising in 2006. What were the lasting effects?
Fill me in.
Well, it was a turning point. It was led by CONE, the National Indigenous Organization, and it was all about resisting a free trade agreement with the U.S. They saw it as a threat to their land, their culture, their whole way of life.
Sounds familiar.
Oh, it is. There were protests and road blockades. The government came down hard, arresting people, accusing them of terrorism, and trying to smear the indigenous leaders in the media.
Classic tactics, unfortunately.
Yeah, but you know what? Despite all that, CONE came out of the uprising stronger. They stopped the free trade agreement and forced the government to listen.
So, a victory, but hard won.
It was. Now, how about Peru? They were dealing with similar pressures, weren't they?
Tell me about it.
They were also under pressure to sign a free trade agreement with the U.S., and indigenous communities were worried, just like in Ecuador.
What were they worried about?
A lot of things. They were worried about being left out of any economic benefits, and that the agreement would lead to even more exploitation of their land.
Do you have any examples of what they were seeing happen on the ground?
Illegal logging of mahogany was a big one. Mahogany is a valuable hardwood, and Peru was a major exporter. But indigenous communities were seeing their forests disappear.
The classic story of short-term profit versus long-term sustainability.
Exactly. They were trying to fight back, filing lawsuits, and trying to get international attention. And you know what else happened? They founded the Andean Coordinating Body for Indigenous Organizations, or CAOI. It brings together indigenous groups from Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru to work on issues like land rights, cultural preservation, and political representation. It was a big moment for cross-border solidarity.
That's awesome. Let's shift gears to Asia and the Pacific now.
Sounds good.
What were some of the big stories happening there in 2007?
In the Philippines, there was the Subanon people's fight against a mining company called TVI.
What was the issue there?
TVI was operating this huge gold and silver mine on Subanon land. The Subanon people said they were causing environmental damage, human rights abuses, and operating without their consent.
Another case of a company taking resources without asking the people who live there?
It was. But the Subanon people were fighting back. They filed legal cases, protested, and even set up blockades.
Sounds intense.
It was, and it was dangerous. They accused TVI of using violence and intimidation.
Where did the Philippine government stand on this?
Well, they had passed the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, or IPRA, back in 1997. It was supposed to recognize indigenous land rights and their right to give consent before anything happened on their land.
Sounds like a good law.
On paper, yeah. But the Subanon people argued the government wasn't doing enough to enforce it and was actually siding with the mining company.
A good law without enforcement doesn't help anyone.
Exactly. Now, what about Indonesia? It's a complicated situation there.
How so?
Well, they have so many different indigenous groups, but the government doesn't recognize indigenous rights at all. They claim that the concept didn't apply to them because almost everyone there was indigenous, except for the Chinese minority.
That's a way to avoid the issue.
It was. And it meant indigenous communities had very little protection for their land and resources.
I bet that caused some conflict.
It did. The expansion of oil palm plantations was a big one. Palm oil is in such high demand globally, and Indonesia is the largest producer. But all those plantations were displacing indigenous communities.
It's like global demand fueling local conflicts.
That's it. But there was a little bit of hope. A research report came out that highlighted the rights of indigenous people to their land, especially in relation to those plantations. It showed that in some provinces, customary land rights were being recognized. So at least they had that.
Let's hope that helped. What was going on in Thailand in 2007?
Thailand had a military coup in 2006, which created a lot of instability, especially for indigenous communities in the Northern Highlands.
Coups disrupt everything.
They do. It made an already tough situation worse. A lot of indigenous people didn't have citizenship rights, which meant they couldn't access things like health care and education.
Wow, that's denying them basic human rights.
It is. And then there were the forced evictions. Indigenous villages were being accused of encroaching on forest land and kicked off their land.
Another way to criminalize them just for existing.
Yeah. There were a couple of really bad cases involving Lisu and Aka villages. They'd been there for decades, but the government said they were illegal and evicted them without any compensation or offering them somewhere else to live.
That's terrible. Okay, how about Australia? What was happening there?
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were continuing their struggle for land rights, self-determination, and justice. They faced tons of discrimination, economic marginalization, and they had no control over their traditional lands.
Sounds familiar.
It's a story that's happened all over the world. And there was a really disturbing event in Queensland. An Aboriginal man named Mulrunji Dumaji died in police custody.
Another one of those cases that's so suspicious.
The official report said his injuries were an accident, but a lot of people thought he was assaulted by the police. It caused protests and demands for a real investigation. It just highlighted the lack of trust between Aboriginal communities and law enforcement.
Such a tragedy. Were there any other developments in Australia related to Indigenous rights?
Well, the UN did a report on the human rights situation of Maori in New Zealand, which is connected to Australia geographically and culturally. The report was worried about constitutional protections for Maori, the lack of reparative justice, and inequality. Basically, it said Maori weren't equal or self-determined yet.
So a lot of the same problems in different parts of the world.
That's right. Okay, our last stop is Africa. What was happening there in 2007?
Tell me.
Botswana was still dealing with the controversy around the relocation of San people from the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. The government said they were moved for conservation, but human rights groups said it was to clear the land for diamond mining and tourism.
So basically money.
That's what a lot of people thought. But the San people took the government to court, and in 2006, the High Court ruled in their favor. They said the relocation was illegal.
Wow, a big win for them.
It was, and it got international attention. The UN Commission on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination even got involved.
Speaking of racial discrimination, what about the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Things weren't good there. Indigenous peoples, often called pygmies, weren't protected by law and faced a lot of discrimination. They couldn't participate in politics, had no access to basic services, and logging companies were taking advantage of them.
A recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it was pretty bad. Their health was especially alarming. There were lots of preventable diseases, and healthcare was practically non-existent.
That's awful. They really needed legal recognition and protection.
They did. Wow, that was a whirlwind tour of Indigenous issues in 2007. What stands out to you the most?
Honestly, it's the resilience of Indigenous peoples all over the world. They face so many challenges, but they just keep fighting for their rights, their cultures, and their future. It's incredible.
I agree. And their stories are so important. We have a lot to learn from them.
Definitely. There's so much more to unpack here.
Oh, yeah, we're just getting started. You know, as we're looking at all these individual stories from 2007, it's important to remember that there are also some big global trends affecting Indigenous communities everywhere.
Oh, yeah, like what?
Well, one of the biggest was the growing influence of international agreements and declarations on Indigenous rights.
So like a top-down approach to change, setting standards for how governments should treat Indigenous populations.
Exactly. A prime example is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Right. That was a big deal.
It was. They were debating it at the United Nations, and it was really aiming to create this comprehensive framework for protecting Indigenous rights all over the world.
That sounds like it could have been a game changer.
It was. But it did face some pushback from a few countries.
Why? What were they worried about?
Some countries, particularly in Africa, were worried about the implications of self-determination.
What do you mean?
They saw it as a potential threat to national unity. They were afraid it could lead to separatist movements.
Right, that fear of things breaking apart.
Yeah, and there were also concerns about the right to free, prior, and informed consent.
What was the issue there?
Some governments saw it as a veto power that could hold back development projects.
So basically a tension between Indigenous rights and national interests.
Exactly. But even with that opposition, the declaration was gaining momentum. Indigenous groups all over the world were mobilizing to support it, and it was eventually adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007.
That's great news. It sounds like Indigenous communities are really making their voices heard on a global level.
They are. And there's another global trend I wanted to touch on, the growing recognition of Indigenous knowledge systems.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one. What's so special about Indigenous knowledge?
Well, it's based on centuries of observing and interacting with the natural world.
Right, it's like a deep understanding passed down through generations.
Exactly. It's holistic, place-based, and often passed down orally. It's incredibly valuable.
I can see that.
And for a long time, it was dismissed or ignored. But in 2007, people were starting to realize its value.
Like what kind of value?
Well, think about it. Indigenous knowledge includes things like medicinal plants, sustainable agriculture, and how to manage ecosystems. This knowledge could be key to solving some of the big challenges we face today, like climate change.
So not just preserving it because it's interesting, but using it to solve real-world problems.
Yes. There was this growing movement to document and revitalize these knowledge systems, to learn from them, and even incorporate them into modern science and policymaking.
That's pretty cool. It sounds like 2007 was a year of growing awareness and recognition of Indigenous rights and knowledge.
It was. But let's zoom back in on some specific regional issues. Earlier, we touched on Botswana, but I want to talk more about the Democratic Republic of Congo. What was the situation like for indigenous people there?
Right, they weren't doing so well.
No, they weren't. The DRC has this large indigenous population who are often referred to as pygmies, and they face a lot of marginalization and exploitation.
We talked about it briefly before, but what are the root causes of that marginalization?
It's a bunch of things, really. There's historical prejudice, lack of legal recognition, and widespread poverty.
It's always the most vulnerable who suffer the most.
It's true. And on top of all that, the DRC has been through decades of conflict and instability, which makes things even worse.
Right, so it's like a perfect storm of bad circumstances.
Yeah, and to make things even worse, the government didn't even recognize them as a distinct people with rights. There was no legal framework to protect their lands or their cultures.
That's awful. No wonder they were being exploited.
Logging companies were especially bad. They were notorious for just coming in and taking their land, often with the help of corrupt government officials.
So frustrating.
It was a terrible situation. But there were some people trying to help. International organizations like the Forest Peoples Program were documenting the human rights abuses and advocating for legal reforms. They were also trying to help indigenous communities stand up for their rights.
It sounds like a very difficult fight.
It was. They were up against some powerful forces. But it shows that even in the darkest of situations, there are people working to make things better.
Let's hope they were successful. Now, I want to talk about a region that was facing some pretty unique challenges in 2007, the circumpolar north.
Ah, yes, the Arctic.
What were some of the key issues affecting indigenous communities up there?
Well, the Arctic was on the front lines of climate change. The sea ice was melting at an alarming rate, and that was a direct threat to the indigenous way of life.
Right, they rely on the ice for hunting, fishing, transportation, pretty much everything.
Exactly. Their whole culture was built around it. And it wasn't just about the physical environment either. The melting ice was also opening up new possibilities for things like resource extraction, shipping, and tourism.
So more economic opportunities, but also more potential for exploitation and damage.
It was a real double-edged sword. Indigenous communities were caught in the middle, trying to figure out how to navigate all of this while also protecting their homelands and their cultures.
I can imagine that was a tough balancing act.
It was. And it was happening all over the Arctic. In Canada, for instance, there were big disputes over oil and gas development in the Mackenzie Valley and the Beaufort Sea. Some indigenous communities were actually divided on the issue.
Some saw it as a chance for economic development.
Right, but others were worried about the environmental consequences. It was a really tough decision to make.
I bet it was. And who ultimately got to decide? Who had the power in these situations?
That was a big part of the problem. Indigenous communities were often left out of the decision-making process. The Arctic Council was supposed to be addressing these issues, but it didn't always do a great job of representing indigenous interests.
Right. The Arctic Council is that intergovernmental forum made up of the Arctic nations.
Exactly. It was a good platform for dialogue, but it didn't have much power to enforce anything, and it was often criticized for siding with the member states rather than indigenous communities.
So basically, more power to the governments, less to the indigenous people.
Yeah, that was the problem. Indigenous organizations were trying to change that. They were pushing for more involvement in the decision-making processes.
Makes sense. They're the ones who live there, so they should have a say.
Exactly. Their knowledge and experience are essential for finding sustainable solutions in the Arctic. Speaking of regions facing the impact of climate change, how about the Pacific Islands?
Oh, that's another area with unique challenges. What were some of the issues facing indigenous communities there?
Well, they were dealing with rising sea levels, more intense storms, and overfishing because of climate change. All of these things were putting huge pressure on indigenous communities who depend on fishing and coastal resources.
It's like a direct assault on their way of life.
It was. And it was forcing them to make impossible choices. Some were being forced to relocate from their ancestral lands because of the rising sea, while others were struggling to adapt their fishing practices because there were fewer fish to catch.
Those are awful choices to have to make. Were there any success stories, any communities that found ways to adapt and survive?
There were a few. Some were turning back to traditional knowledge and practices. They were using sustainable fishing techniques and working to restore damaged coastal ecosystems.
So going back to their roots to find solutions.
Exactly. And there was this growing movement for self-determination, too, with some Pacific Island nations pushing for more autonomy or even full independence from colonial powers.
Way to take back control.
That's it. Let's move on to Latin America now. What were some of the common themes emerging from the indigenous struggles there?
Fill me in.
Well, the fight for land rights, cultural recognition, and political participation continued to be major issues in 2007.
Same old story, unfortunately.
Sadly, it is. Indigenous communities were being pushed off their land by extractive industries, agribusiness, and these big infrastructure projects. It was all about profit and development, with very little regard for indigenous rights.
Were there any signs of hope? Any pushback against this?
Definitely. Indigenous movements were growing stronger and more vocal. They were demanding a seat at the table, a voice in the decisions that affected their lives.
They weren't going to be silenced anymore.
Exactly. And they were starting to see some wins. They were winning legal battles, getting land titles, and gaining more control over the resources.
People power. Were there any particular movements or events that really stood out in 2007?
Absolutely. In Bolivia, they had Evo Morales, their first indigenous president, and he was doing some amazing things.
Like what?
He was nationalizing natural resources, promoting indigenous languages and cultures, and pushing for a new constitution that recognized indigenous rights.
That's amazing. A
Yeah.
leader who's actually fighting for them.
It was a big moment for Latin America. It showed that indigenous people could achieve political power and use it to make real change. And it wasn't just Bolivia. In Ecuador and Guatemala, indigenous movements were becoming major players in national politics, forming their own parties and winning seats in parliament.
So they were going from the margins to the center of power.
Exactly. And it was starting to pay off. They were winning legal battles, securing land titles, and gaining more control over their natural resources.
So much progress happening. Now let's talk about Southeast Asia. I understand there was a surge in indigenous activism happening there in 2007.
There was. It was a really dynamic time.
What was driving all this activism?
Lots of things. Rapid economic development, land grabbing, and the erosion of traditional cultures were all playing a role.
Sounds like a recipe for unrest.
It was. Countries like Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam were going through massive economic transformations. But indigenous communities were often paying the price. They were losing their land to make way for things like dams, mines, and plantations.
Progress always comes at a cost, it seems.
It often does. And indigenous people were fighting back. They were demanding land rights, recognition of their cultures, and a say in what happened to their land.
Sounds like they were taking a stand.
They were. And they were using a variety of tactics. In Cambodia, for example, they were filing legal challenges, organizing protests, and working with international NGOs to put pressure on the government. In Laos, they were fighting for recognition of their customary land rights and resisting policies that were trying to force them to assimilate.
So a fight for both land and culture.
Exactly. Unfortunately, this resistance was often met with repression. The governments didn't like being challenged.
Power never does.
It's true. But despite the risks, these indigenous movements were getting stronger and more sophisticated.
We were learning how to fight back effectively.
They were, and it was making a difference. Okay, let's go back to Africa for a moment. We already talked about Botswana and the DRC, but what were some of the broader trends happening across the continent?
What else was going on?
One big thing was the growing recognition of indigenous rights by regional bodies, like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights.
That's encouraging.
It was. They had a working group on indigenous populations communities in Africa, and they were actively working to promote and protect indigenous rights.
What were some of their main concerns?
Land rights, cultural rights, political participation, and the impacts of development projects on indigenous communities. They were also conducting fact-finding missions, issuing reports, and holding governments accountable for human rights violations.
That's great. Someone needs to hold those governments accountable.
Exactly. And it was making a difference. Indigenous communities were starting to use the African Commission to file complaints and demand justice.
That's awesome. They were finally getting a platform to fight for their rights. So zooming out now, what are some of the key takeaways from all of this? What did we learn about indigenous issues in 2007?
Well, one thing that really stands out is the interconnectedness of all these struggles. Even though indigenous communities are spread out all over the world and have different cultures and histories, they're facing a lot of the same challenges.
Right, like land grabbing, cultural assimilation, political marginalization, and climate change. It's a global pattern of injustice.
It is. And it highlights how important solidarity and collaboration are for these movements. They're realizing that they're stronger together.
There's power in numbers.
Absolutely. And what about the role of international organizations and institutions? Did they make a difference?
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, it's a mixed bag. Some organizations, like the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the International Labor Organization, were doing good work. They were promoting indigenous rights and trying to hold governments accountable.
So some good guys in the mix.
Yes. But other institutions, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, weren't always so helpful. They were actually promoting policies that ended up hurting indigenous communities.
So even within these big international organizations, there's a struggle for power and influence.
There is. And I think that's another big takeaway, the importance of challenging power structures, both local and global.
Right, questioning the status quo and demanding better.
Exactly. Indigenous peoples are showing us that real change requires confronting those in power and demanding a more just and equitable world.
A powerful message. And while there's still so much work to do, it's important to acknowledge the victories and progress that were made in 2007. It gives us hope.
It does. And it shows that change is possible when people come together and fight for what's right. It's amazing to see all the progress that was happening for indigenous communities in 2007,
Yeah.
especially with all the challenges they were up against.
It really is inspiring. But you mentioned there were still some more stories to tell from that year.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I want to talk about the Arctic.
The Arctic. What was going on up there?
It was experiencing this incredible resurgence of indigenous culture and activism.
Really? I don't think we've touched on that yet.
Well, all across the Arctic, from Greenland to Alaska to Siberia, indigenous communities were reclaiming their languages, revitalizing their cultures, and demanding more control over their lives.
It sounds like they were really coming into their own.
They were. And I think it was partly a response to all the threats they were facing. Climate change, resource extraction, cultural assimilation, all of that.
Right, we talked about those challenges earlier. So they were fighting back, asserting their strength and protecting their heritage.
Exactly. And they were doing it with this incredible sense of pride. Like in Greenland, they were pushing for more autonomy from Denmark.
We talked about that before. Were there any particular events that sparked that renewed push?
It wasn't so much a single event, but more like a growing sense of urgency. They felt like Denmark wasn't listening to their concerns or acting fast enough.
They wanted to take control of their own destiny.
Exactly. And it was happening all over the Arctic. In Alaska, the native corporations were gaining a lot of power, both economically and politically.
Right, those corporations created by ANCSA.
Yep, they were using their influence to invest in their communities, support cultural initiatives, and advocate for their rights.
So they were turning that corporate structure into a tool for good.
That's a good way to put it. And it wasn't just in Alaska. In Canada, the Inuit were creating self-governing territories, like Nunavut.
That's incredible. I can't imagine how much work went into making that happen.
It was a huge achievement. They wanted a government that represented their values and their aspirations.
A government that truly reflected who they are. That's powerful.
It is. But even with all this progress, they were still facing challenges, of course. Climate change was still a huge threat, and there was more and more pressure for resource development. The fight for land rights and cultural recognition was far from over.
It's a constant battle.
It is. But looking back at 2007, what really stands out to me is the incredible resilience, determination, and adaptability of indigenous communities all over the world.
I agree. They've faced so much adversity, but they continue to fight for their rights and protect their cultures.
They're an inspiration, and they're leading the way in so many areas: environmental protection, language revitalization, social justice.
Their voices deserve to be heard.
They do. And their stories need to be told. We all have a responsibility to listen, to learn, and to support their fight.
Because their fight is our fight, ultimately. It's a fight for a better world for all of us.
That's right. A world that's more just, equitable, and sustainable.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us into the Indigenous World 2007. We hope you learned something new and that it inspires you to keep learning and to support the fight for Indigenous rights.
Thanks for having me.